For those of you that don't know me, my name's Jeff Garvas. My call sign's N8YNR. And the presentation I'm putting on today is kind of a hobby of mine since I was a teenager. Actually predates my interest in ham radio. I discovered scanning police and fire as a teen. I became licensed in 1993, and I've been a LIRA trustee since 1999. I've coordinated the amateur radio, SAG, and EMS communication needs for the National MS Society's MS 150 Bike Tour for over 20 years. That's the event Matt just asked me to speak to in August. I started that in August of 1993 as a teenager, just a couple of months after getting my license to talk in ham radio, and sat in an EMS vehicle and began my tour with that event and worked it ever since 1993. Professionally, I am a network engineer with Verizon Wireless. I hold a number of Cisco certifications in routing, switching, and voice over IP technology. I have a background working for all kinds of different networking service providers and different telephony industry value-added resellers, but I've been with Verizon for 17 years at this point. I have been involving this presentation that you're about to see since 2017. It actually was born out of a number of emails that LIRA used to get asking how to scan from the general public. And we eventually turned it into a presentation, and I have presented it to LIRA 2 or 3 times, to the Hamfest Association back, I don't know, 2018, I think I did one live, and last summer I did it for the Geauga Amateur Radio Association. This is the first time I've done it for Aries. Hopefully, if any of you see anything in here that you'd like me to dwell upon more in future versions of this, or if you have any corrections, please don't hesitate to give me your feedback after the event. If you're not muted, I would ask that you do mute, because we are recording this in hopes of making a more recent version of this presentation available on YouTube. So what I hope to cover is a brief history of scanners from the 1970s to now. Very brief, I won't bore you going that far back. I am going to give you an introduction to trunked radio systems and simulcasting. The idea of this presentation was to start from, an audience of people that don't know anything about scanning, and then it gets aggressively more complicated as it goes on, and it actually will end in using software-defined radio, which is a little bit more of an advanced topic. We will talk about multi-site trunk radio systems, or in the state of Ohio, what's called MARCS. I will talk about the differences between conventional and trunked radio. I'm going to give an overview of how dispatching has changed, and I know that's a key interest for this audience today. I'm going to explain some scanning challenges and how to overcome them. It's actually a little bit of the humor in the presentation. And I'm going to tell you what scanner you should buy or avoid. And quite frankly, since I started presenting this slide deck in 2017, that recommendation has changed, and I now will specifically tell you that you should buy one of 2 radios, but we'll elaborate on that. I will briefly explain how to program your scanner. We could talk for 2.5 to 3 hours on how to program a scanner. It could be a presentation in and of itself. Frankly, if you need help with that after the fact, we can always talk after the fact about something like that. But in this presentation, it would take a lot of time. I will talk about listening to digital systems on a computer for just 20 bucks. If you're a hobbyist and a tinkerer, I'll show you how to do that. But again, at a very high level. Here's a rough idea of what I'm going to cover. These slide counts are probably off. I did this slide specifically for the Hamfest Association of Cleveland because people may have wanted to walk out. But this is how it's going to cover. But I'm sure the quantity of slides is actually a little bit different. I do ask that you hold your questions and comments till the end, partially because we are recording this, also because it'll help me get through the slides quicker. If you really can't wait until the end and you need to interrupt me, that's okay. If you're doing it just to correct me, maybe tell me after the fact. I would appreciate that. So here we go. A long time ago, scanners used to be really simple. Back in the 1975 to 81 timeframe, you basically had physical channels. You typically put crystals in them, or if it was, not crystal controlled, it had a very limited number of channels because you really didn't have a lot of things you were going to listen to. In 1987, Regency came out with something called the TurboScan TS2. I don't remember where I picked this thing up, but it was my favorite scanner ever. I would say, well, maybe when I was young. One of the coolest things about this is it went from 30 megahertz to 900 megahertz uninterrupted, which back in the 90s meant you could listen to cell phone calls. And I did for hours on end. The other cool thing about this is, unlike any scanner you look at today, you could group your channels anywhere. It used to be in, the Unitons and the GREs, you had to put things in banks, channels 1 through 10. In the Regency, it didn't care where you put it. You could put any frequency anywhere you want. And that was kind of, significant for that era of technology with scanners. So what is the biggest challenge that you run into when you're listening to your scanner? Let's say you're listening to one channel, the police or the fire, and you wonder what you're missing on the others, right? There's no way to fix that, right? Unless you just go out and buy more scanners. And if you've seen this presentation before, I apologize. I know this joke is 4 years old, but the presentation's free, right? So the idea of more scanners is you could dedicate one to fire, you could have one that sits on the simplex frequency that the cops joke on, and you can have one dedicated to police. This theme is actually going to play out through this presentation a lot, and it really does become important, and you'll see why as we get into how you monitor digital systems. So let's talk about where and who you can get the scanners from. And this has been the case for pretty much as long as I've been alive. You could buy a scanner from Uniden, you could buy a scanner from GRE, and you used to be able to buy a scanner from Radio Shack. Now, for the longest time, Uniden and GRE made the scanners that Radio Shack sold. They just put the Radio Shack brand on them. You can actually take most of the Radio Shack scanners, like the 197s, and hold it up next to a GRE 500, and they look identical except for the color of the case. They have the same, basically the same firmware in them and the same menus. They were the same scanner. It just mattered at what time you purchased the scanner from Radio Shack that would determine if it came from Uniden or if it came from GRE. At some point, GRE became the sole manufacturer of those radios. But in September of 2013, Whistler Group came around and they purchased all of the assets of GRE. And that turned into, where can we buy scanners from? Well, GRE and Radio Shack are gone. And now if you want to buy a scanner, you can buy it from Uniden or Whistler, or of course the used scanner market. There are some minor changes to that, but if you're going out to buy a consumer grade scanner from a store, basically from Amazon, you're basically going to buy it probably from Uniden or probably from Whistler. So let's look at some radios. These were the radios that I used to present in this presentation back in 2017 as what you were most likely going to buy if you bought something new. The top left was Uniden's flagship handheld. The bottom left was Whistler's flagship handheld, and the right was their equivalent desktop or mobile scanners. The top one, that 536, I actually have one sitting right next to me right now. I lowered the volume a little bit so you guys wouldn't hear it in the background. That was Uniden's Phase 2 Home Patrol line. It was cream of the crop. The bottom right was Whistler's TRX2. It was their mobile version. The best thing that Whistler ever did was make a detachable faceplate radio. Uniden has yet to this day been able to catch up and figure that out. It's one of my frustrations with Uniden because I drive a modern vehicle and there is no DIN hole that you can remove in the dashboard and slide a radio into. Uniden hasn't gotten the message on that. They still make the radios like they're supposed to go into a DIN slot in a car. But I don't recommend these radios anymore, and I will explain why. Let's jump to what I would recommend, and that is either the Uniden SDS 100, or on a future slide here, I'll show you the mobile or desktop version. And just to get this out of the way, these are $650. They're quite expensive, and the vast majority of that cost comes from the licensing expenses of the radio because of the technology that's in them, and that's why they cost so much. The main reason these scanners cost so much is they have that superior QPSK demodulation compared to any other scanner that predates the SDS model, both in the Whistler or Uniden line. And we'll explain that a little bit when I get down to Simulcast. But if you want a reliable handheld in the Cleveland area, or basically almost anywhere in the state of Ohio, where simulcast distortion is not going to make you wish that you had a better radio, you want an SDS. Hands down, short of going out and buying a Motorola and putting it on the system, this is going to give you the best signal quality, the best decode, etc. There are upgrades to this radio that cost in the range of $30 to $60 if you need DMR or NXDN or Pro Voice. Typically, if you're listening to almost any public service in Northeast Ohio, you don't need any of those upgrades, but we'll talk about that a little bit. This is the desktop version of the 100. It is $50 more than the handheld right now, and it's bigger than the typical DIN radio, so it's even harder to mount in your car. And of course, it's 2021, and Uniden still hasn't gotten the message that faceplates should be detachable. I am still bitter about that because I love Uniden radios, but I'm going to struggle to put one of these in my car. It's basically the same radio, but with a bigger obvious front panel. You have an Ethernet port on the front of it, so you can actually connect it to your network, and you could listen to this throughout your house on an app. You don't have to be sitting in front of it. One thing I didn't mention is almost every modern scanner that I've shown you in the past 3 slides have micro SD cards in them. So you need to be aware of that. Everything is stored on that micro SD card. It can be corrupted if you have a sudden power loss as opposed to a graceful shutdown. So you just need to be aware that all of the intelligence and the database and the frequency information in your scanners is now stored on a micro SD card. In the past, it was just an NVRAM, and you could just suddenly lose power to a scanner and it wasn't a big deal. Now it's a big deal. So the rest of this slide deck used to show radios that I recommended, and I now consider the rest of these as just okay. If you want a radio that's going to give you the best possible experience, you want one of the 2 I just showed you, either an SDS 100 or an SDS 200. If you don't have that budget and you're willing to fight the challenges of simulcast or multipath, the rest of these radios are an option, but every one of you is going to have a different result with this. So I also want to point out that Whistler isn't necessarily dead. They have been pretty good at coming out with new technology in this space, and I would be shocked if they don't come out with a competitive CQ PSK capable radio that competes with the SDS 100 and 200 Unidens. I just don't know when or even if, but they should do it. So the Home Patrol 1 and 2, these are real tiny, almost wallet size radios that you can buy. I don't recommend, if you're going to go out and buy one, that you get the Home Patrol 1. I would go with the version 2, just because you might as well have that phase 2 capability. And we'll talk about what phase 2 is here in a little bit. They are a very visual touchscreen type scanner. They are programmed with the same software that the 530, every radio that I've shown you so far is programmed with in the Uniden line. You are not going to get upgrades on these if you need DMR, Pro Voice, or NXDN, and they run about $503. So I honestly would recommend, if you're going to get a new radio and you're already talking about spending $503, you might as well get an SDS. It just makes sense. This is the Uniden 996P2. You'll see as I go through these slides that the 996 is a common model line of the Uniden. This was the first one they made in this form factor with this firmware and menu structure that was capable of doing phase 2. You can get one of these in our part of the state, and the only benefit this would get you is there is one system in our area that uses phase 2. But eventually the rest of the world is going to come along and probably end up on phase 2. So we're probably at the point where if you can afford a phase 2 radio, you might as well buy one. And frankly, if you're buying new, you should buy an SDS 100 or 200 and you'll get phase 2 inherently. This is the predecessor of the phase 2 version. They made the 996T and the XT. I do have a number of these. They have, in my opinion, superior audio over the GRE 600s and most of the Whistler brand, specifically on analog. And they sell on eBay for anywhere from $150 to $200. One thing I will mention is anytime I'm talking about prices in the scanner market right now, just know that because of the pandemic and the massive demand for things to do, people have been buying scanners left and right. New scanners are constantly on back order, and the used market is actually a little bit more pricey. So these are probably still at least at $200, and they could be more right now. This is a phase 1 only capable scanner, so it will still work in the vast majority of Northeast Ohio, but we'll get into that when we talk about phase 1 and phase 2. This is the GRE 600. I had a handful of these. I think I only have one left. The nice thing about this radio is if you're going to do computer-based stuff with it, like decoding the control channel, The blue PCIF port that you see up here in the top right corner has the ability to just stream the data channel right into your computer's serial port without any modifications. If you wanted to do that to a Uniden, you'd have to crack open the case and solder some connections and tap into the discriminator audio to do it. In the GRE, it's literally just a headphone-sized plug that you plug into your serial port. The handheld version of this used to sell for $275 on eBay, but that may not be the case anymore. I haven't looked for one of those on eBay lately, and I haven't updated that particular slide. Now, if you are looking in the used market, do not fall for the BCT15X trap. It looks like every other 996. You'll see it listed for an outrageously low price, and you'll think you're getting a deal. The reality is this is an analog only scanner. So if you intend to do anything digital with this, you will be sorely mistaken and trying to return it or sell it, because it will only trunk analog. And there's no commercial, there's no public service analog trunk tracking anywhere in Ohio that I know of right now. There might be some business band or some commercial, but this is not what you might think it is. And I highly recommend don't buy this unless you know for a fact that it'll fit your needs. So prior to the SDSs coming out in the Uniden market, there was a commercial device called the Unication G4 and G5 pager. These are actually pagers used by the fire service on the digital systems, so they can get their alerts and their calls on a small device they could wear on their belt. And a lot of scanner enthusiasts started purchasing these and programming them to listen to the actual talk groups that they were interested in. And they performed better than the 436 and the Whistlers before the SDS came out. For the cost point of one of these devices, you might as well just go buy an SDS at this point. But since this was already in the slide deck and it's an option, I want to make sure that we communicated out there that if you can find a used Unication, it works as a P25 receiving device, just like a scanner does, but with the limitations that it's really meant to be a pager. And then finally, I just like to point out that you can purchase SDR receivers. These are where the hobby turns into more of a hobby and it's more complicated. And the last 10 or so slides of this presentation will go into talking about how you can use these things. But for the typical user who just wants to buy something they can turn on, you don't want to do this. You want to buy an actual scanner. So finally, let's talk about what Broadcastify is. If you've never heard about this and you don't know about it, you can listen to other people's scanners over the internet using apps. I'm a feed provider for Broadcastify. You actually see one of my feeds up there in the screenshots. And I'm a big advocate of the app Scanner Radio Deluxe. And he's changed the name a couple of times. It might just be called Scanner Radio, but it has this orange and gray color scheme to it. There is a free version and a paid version. And one of the main reasons I like this is it can do things that other apps don't. One of them is it will do notifications based on the quantity of people listening to a given feed. So down here in the bottom right, you can see it said that particular feed had 485 listeners. You could have a threshold of 10 or 15, and anytime that threshold is exceeded, your phone would notify you that one of your scanner feeds that you're interested in suddenly has a lot of people listening to it. And 9 times out of 10, that means something big is going on. The other thing that it does is it shows you this text here where it says 11:14 p.m. That is the alert text that the feed owner typed in. So someone like me who knows that something's going on can go into the back end of the system, type in the details of what's going on, and it actually pushes that alert out. A lot of the apps out there that listen to the feeds don't support that feature. And therefore it's, I don't like them as much as this app. Here's another pop-up showing you how many people were listening. That's what it looks like as a notification on the iPhone. So monitoring fire tones. A lot of people don't know this, but you can typically set most scanners to do what's called fire tone detection. The pagers that are used typically have a 2-tone sequence. Usually it's 1 second on of one tone and 3 seconds on of a different tone. And you can configure a scanner to listen just for that instead of acting off of squelch alone. And then it would open its squelch and play that particular frequency, so you could hear that tone. There's also a program out there called two-tone detect. I've used it for quite a few years to do the same exact thing, but instead of it opening the squelch on a scanner, it actually SMS texts me and tells me, hey, there's a fire tone detected, and here's the next 60 seconds of audio. The problem with these is as more and more departments are going to digital, they're either completely forgoing those tones, or when they play those tones over the digital system, the quality of the tone is compromised and it's harder to detect the tone. But if you're interested in listening to fire tones, it's something you can explore. So many of you are here to learn about trunked radio. So let's talk about what trunked radio is and how it came about. Historically, local agencies were all on FM. Trunking came around originally in the form of analog audio. So there was a digital system behind it telling all the radios which frequency to hop to. But when they were actually talking, the audio portion of it was a traditional FM, conventional analog non-digital audio path. However, as that process evolved, we went from LTR and EDAX in the 80s to digital trunk tracking in like early 2000s. That's when phase 1 of Project 25 came along, and then eventually phase 2 came along. Now, since then, there have been some evolutions where other technologies have created NXDN and Pro Voice and DMR. We're not going to talk much about that because thankfully in Ohio, at least, we don't have to worry about that. So if you've never learned anything about trunk radio and you don't understand what it is, at a very high level, trunking is basically the use of multiple repeater pairs pulled together to make up dynamically allocated voice channels. Now, if that doesn't make any sense, hopefully the next few slides will explain it. But basically, police, fire, and other logical channels in a trunk system are called talk groups. We don't call them frequencies or anything, we call them talk groups. There's a computer behind the whole system that tells every radio in the system which voice channel to listen to or to transmit into when they push that push to talk button on the side of the radio. It uses a dedicated frequency pair in the system for that control channel. All the instructions to or from the radios take place on the control channel. So it transmits its instructions on the output and it listens for radios on the input. And usually that output side is a continuous stream of data. Every radio in the system is pre-programmed with the initial system control channel frequencies. And similar to a cell phone, if it's going to leave and go to a neighboring system, it can learn what the neighboring system's control channels are, or sometimes they can just be programmed into the radio. And you can also, since they're basically a computer that's addressable over the radio or over the air, they can actually send updates and configuration changes to them frequently. So this is a drawing just to give you a depiction and a conceptualization of a single tower with a trunked system on it. The very top box is meant to show you the control channel, and the bottom 4 boxes are voice channels. So all the radios are listening to that control channel, and if they want to send to it commands or requests, they transmit into its receive frequency and they listen for instruction on its transmit frequency. If somebody keys up their radio and the control channel grants them permission to do so, it will instruct them which one of those 4 channels on the bottom to go to talk into, and it will instruct every other radio associated with that talk group which one of those transmit frequencies it should listen to, so it hears everything. If you take that a step further though, most sites like Cleveland's have multiple repeater sites. They don't just have one site. And they all simulcast on the same exact frequency. They still have that central controller making all the decisions on that primary control channel, but every one of those sites is going to transmit in what we call simulcast, and it's going to have the same information on the same frequency at the same exact time. And those tower sites are connected between each other either using existing telephone circuits or microwave links. And it looks a little bit like this. These are 5 of the sites in the Cleveland system. And as you can see, I put the same exact frequencies in each of the channel boxes. And the control channel is the same across all of them. This is what creates the simulcast problem we'll talk about, because you now have 5 different sites transmitting at the same exact time from 5 different geographic locations. The benefit of this is you cover the entire county with RF. So you fill all the nooks and crannies and all the valleys. and the handheld radios are more likely to succeed at working. The downside is conventional scanners have typically a struggle with this type of transmission approach. So what does it look like? These are all of the frequencies in Cleveland's system. All of the black frequencies are voice channels. All of the red channels that you see in the bottom right corner are potential control channels. And only one of them at any given point in time is going to be the control channel. And the radios know that, and they will move if there's a problem and it needs to fail to one of the other control channels. But that doesn't happen very often. And typically, if you were to look at this, because you can visualize it, the system is not using every single one of those voice channels that you see in black. Now, I actually have a slide here that kind of depicts it. Now, if you wanted to see the equipment, which I'm sure a lot of you would love to, this is what it looks like in a bunch of racks. Now, I believe this picture came from Motorola when they were building Summit County's site. I don't think this is it deployed anywhere, but this was them testing the Summit County system long before it was ever deployed. If we were to take the control channel of a site like this and put it into a program called Unitrunker, we can see what it looks like. And this will loop, but basically what I'm trying to show you here is all of the channels that you see or frequencies that you see in white on the left are potential frequencies that can be used for voice. And as you see a blue line of text show up, that was a radio keying up. The talk group that they were on is the column that's titled target. And the radio that the transmission came from is under the column labeled source. And the thing I wanted to show with this particular slide is you can see that right now the 4th district is on a frequency ending in 7125, but in a couple of seconds they'll be on a completely different frequency. And that's because the frequencies have become, for the most part, irrelevant, and anybody can move to any frequency when they key up. It's dynamically allocated as they key up. And just looking at this, you can see that less than a third of all those white frequencies are in use. That's one of the benefits of the system, is you have a large quantity of channels, but a very small amount of utilization. So let's talk about conventional versus trunking, and hopefully this will explain why it's so beneficial to go to trunking. There is an example police department. I happen to live in the city of Macedonia, and prior to last week, we used to use 423.625 as our primary dispatch for our police department. If you look at this waveform at the bottom of the screen, these little blue graphs or little blue waveforms that you see in Audacity are typically 2 to 5 second long transmissions. If you look at all the gaps, you can see that there is a substantial amount of unused or inefficient use of that frequency, that 423.625. So you've got one department that very infrequently uses the frequency. Trunking takes a whole number of agencies and puts them into a shared pool of frequency pairs. And despite using that same pool of frequencies, everyone's isolated. They don't know that the other people are there. It's far more efficient use of that spectrum. So you've got those 26 frequencies instead of one frequency for every city in the system. And one moment you might have a given frequency used for the police, the next minute it's the trash or the water department, or it could be the police department. So you've now got the benefit of scale, right? You're filling all those little gaps where other people were typically leaving the frequency unused. They're now available to all the other users of a larger system. That's really at a high level the benefit of trunking from a utilization and a bandwidth efficiency space, or a spectrum utilization initiative. And that's why trunking, the main reason that they did it was to reclaim spectrum. So now you can serve a large community of people in a county with just 30 frequencies and 30 repeaters technically. The other main reasons are interoperability. In Summit County, we have something called mutual aid channels, or MAC channels. We also have MERC channels, they're major emergency regional communications channels. Those don't get used as much as the MAC channels. I'm a huge proponent of the way our county uses MAC. Basically, if there is a large event, and it could be either law enforcement or fire, but predominantly it's used for fire. If they have 3 or 4 cities coming to a fire, instead of them going to some fire ground channel that belongs to the city that has the fire, the county assigns them a MAC channel on the fly over the air, and every single responding agency goes to that MAC channel and uses it for the duration of that incident. When they're done, they release it back to the county. And there are 11 of those available, and they're used quite efficiently and effectively. It's also a fun way of listening to things in the county. Cleveland has something called the region channels, or region IO, depending upon who you're talking to. They stand for interoperability. They're used for all kinds of events, but usually they're big events. So for instance, they were just used, and they're probably currently being used for the NFL draft, the championship parade, the riots, the RNC, and any major downtown event, you'll find one or two of the region channels in use typically. But in my opinion, the Cleveland public safety agencies don't embrace them as well as they could when they're helping each other out. MARCS has its own interoperability talk groups, MCOM, ECOM, LECOM. They're all used for different purposes. LECOM, a lot of people read that and think it stands for law enforcement, which is a logical conclusion to make, but it actually stands for local event. So one day you may actually hear police using it, and then the next day you might hear somebody like our event for Pedal to the Point using it. The other reason we go to trunking is the better coverage with simulcasting. So when you have a county just blanketed with towers, you fill in all those nooks and crannies and you dramatically improve performance. And I have an example down here at the bottom that I'm just going to jump to. I live in the city of Macedonia. For the past, I don't know how many years, ever since we went to narrow banding of public safety frequencies, when our ambulance would drive up to Hillcrest Hospital, you couldn't hear them. You would hear the squelch break and a bunch of garble, but you had no idea what they said. We just moved to the MARCS system last week, and every time they send an ambulance to Hillcrest, you can hear it perfectly. Now, part of that is because of the way MARCS works. They're actually, when those ambulances go up there, they're actually affiliating to the Cleveland system in MARCS, and they're able to get back. But that's one of the benefits of these digital systems. So I've already said it a couple of times. Cleveland's system has 26 voice frequencies. Rarely are more than 10 of them actually active. We know that there are 394 talk groups, but there are probably more. And the reason is you can't just go to the FCC and say, tell me all the talk groups. It's not like you have to license each talk group like you used to license a frequency. So the way that we figure out what those talk groups are is through people like us listening and building the backend database. There are 3 different public service purpose digital systems in Cuyahoga County. There's the GCRCN, which stands for Greater Cleveland Regional Communications Network, or the Cleveland system, MARCS, which is a statewide system, and Parma has their own system. We'll talk about some of them and the benefits and the differences, but let's talk about the politics of having 2 P25 systems in Cuyahoga County. One of the problems you run into is you can see all the cities on the left have gravitated towards the Cleveland system, and all the cities on the right have gravitated toward MARCS. And sometimes this has been a decision based on politics, the cost, or sometimes it's been how well one of the 2 systems performed in the topography and the peaks and valleys of a given city. If we lived in a perfect world, Cleveland would just make their system a site off of MARCS, and there'd be one system in Cleveland. But unfortunately, we have 2 systems in Cuyahoga County. It is what it is. You can see at the bottom of the page, I have a bunch of site locations listed as conventional FM. I haven't checked every one of those. It's possible some of them on the left are going digital, and I just don't know. On the right, I can tell you that East Cleveland went to an encrypted NXDN system. Last time I updated this, they did. And Lyndhurst just recently got a grant for radios. We just don't know what system they're going to go to. Okay. This is an old slide because this was what the future was going to be in 2017 of the Cleveland, of the Summit County system. And I'm just showing this to show you that just inside Summit County, there were going to be these 10 locations. This has actually been deployed. And as of over a year ago, at least over a year ago, Summit County is basically a site inside MARCS. And it's kind of unique in the sense that the county owns it, but it's part of MARCS. And you'll see that in different places like Geauga County. they own their system, but it is a part of MARCS. If you go to Portage County does not own their system. It is solely run by MARCS. The benefits to that are the county can decide how many towers they're willing to invest in and how well they want to blanket coverage. Whereas if you're dependent upon the state, they may not put as many towers up as a county might choose to. So let's talk about simulcast distortion. This is something you need to understand if you're going to try to use a radio and you're unfortunately impacted by it. So before the Unit and SDS series was designed and came out, scanners typically would just listen, to traditional AM and FM. They didn't listen to QPSK, or, not that anybody needs to know this, quadrature phase shift keying. That's the modulation of these new radios. Well, everything prior to the SDS line did not know how to listen to that, which is why you had this poor quality decode and poor quality experience. These green markers on this map are meant to depict where all the towers are in the Cleveland system. If you're in between towers, you're going to hear the signal come from multiple towers. And it's basically what's called multipath or simulcast distortion. And your radio is going to receive an RF signal from multiple paths, and it typically causes an issue for you. The commercial radios that the police and the fire carry, they cost around $5,000. They can properly time that multipath QPSK signal. They know how to properly decode it. It sounds good 99% of the time in those radios. Scanners get so confused, they either garble the decode or they sit there and act like they're not hearing anything because they can't. They don't comprehend it, or they just can't figure out how to decode the signal that they are receiving. Now, there is a fix. You can move your scanner around. You can try to attenuate it, and counter to conventional thinking, you want to make your scanner more deaf. And the idea there is you're trying to make one of those towers prevail over the others. You can do what's called building a Yagi and aim it. So if you're in a position where you can point a Yagi at a specific tower and there's not another one behind it, then that Yagi in its narrow width or narrow beam is going to get you the desired result of overcoming multipathing, right? That is an option, but it's not always easy to do. What is easy to do is to go out and buy an SDS. So I'm not going to read this whole slide to you. It's mainly here to show you that there are different types of trunking. There's all the different versions of Motorola. Sounds like somebody during that needs to mute. Thank you. There's different types of trunking: Motorola, DMR, EDAX, LTR, NXDN. But the thing we're going to talk about mostly here is Project 25. And the reason for that is the state of Ohio is using it, Cleveland Systems using it, and even the Medina/Parma site, even though it's not Motorola and it's Harris, it is also a P25 system. The DMR around here is traditionally going to be land mobile radio, commercial radios like the Hard Rock Casino, and all that type of stuff. Modern unit and radios can be licensed to support some of those protocols that I've identified up there, whereas Whistler has somehow managed to figure out licensing them into their base radio cost. I don't know how they pulled that off, but usually if you buy Whistler, you just get that functionality. This is just a screenshot. It's actually quite old, so it may be different now, but this was meant to show you from the radio reference database that you can see there are some people out there using DMR or EDAX or LTR, but it's traditionally private business band radio. The one caveat to this is Lindale Police, unless something has changed, they are on one of these DMR systems. I just don't remember which one off the top of my head. They're the only public service, law enforcement agency I know of that isn't on either Cleveland or MARCS or Parma. This slide, everything you see in green, you can ignore. I haven't updated this, but these are basically the systems in Cuyahoga, Summit, and Geauga County. They're basically all Project 25. And one of the things I want you to get from this is the only system here that is phase 2, and this has remained true since 2017, is the Parma system. The Harris system is the only one in the area that is currently phase 2, and more than likely that's going to stay that way for some time. So let's talk about encryption. Encryption, it sucks, and frankly, there's nothing we can do about it. A lot of people think you can. I'm here to dispel all those myths. It's a very hot button topic. There are a lot of places where if you try to discuss it online, you are going to get shut down. You're going to potentially get kicked out of discussion groups or banned from Facebook groups. Sorry about that. There are a number of digital encryption methods out there, triple DES, AES, and the reality is you're never going to crack it. And even if you were handed the key from the system owners and you had a scanner at home, no conventional consumer grade scanner has the technology in it to decode the encryption, let alone the interfaces in its menu system for you to type in the key. So with a consumer grade scanner, there's no way you're going to do it. And even if you did, conventional wisdom says that decrypting someone's communications is probably against the law federally, and you just don't want to do it. Now, what I will tell you is that there's a lot of cases where they have configured their encryption on a given talk group to be selectable at the radio, as opposed to encrypting the entire talk group. It's actually very common with the state patrol, where you'll have 2 or 3 troopers who are talking on a given talk group. One of them has left his radio in encryption and the others have not. So you'll hear 2/3 of the conversation. That can happen anywhere on a talk group that's configured for per radio encryption, as opposed to the entire talk group is always encrypted. I will tell you that there are places that have encrypted that you're just never going to fix. Cleveland police have what are called TAC channels. Strongsville police, North Royalton, East Cleveland, and Akron PD are all encrypted. Rumor has it that Summit County sheriffs are going to go encrypted. And if I didn't put it in here, I didn't. Akron Fire actually encrypted, which is counterintuitive to me, but they did. And there's nothing you can do about it. For the longest time, down here at the bottom of the screen, you see a Broadcastify stream on the internet from Akron Police. They used to stream 15 minutes delayed, but they actually eventually just pulled the plug on this, and you can't even listen to them online anymore. So they are completely in the dark. So I do want to explain the differences between phase 1 and phase 2, but I'm going to try to do this at a very high level. There's a lot of information on this slide for those of you that might want to know all the technical details, but basically the difference between phase 1 and phase 2 is how many voice channels you can fit in that single 12.5 kilohertz chunk of bandwidth. On the next slide, you'll see me show that visually, but that's the main difference with phase 2. When it comes to scanners, though, anything prior to the 996P2 or the home patrol line, like the 536 and the 436, and I think even one of the home patrol, like the little tiny one, I think the last one did phase 2. When you're looking at the radio reference database, you'll know if something is in phase 2 if they've put a T in the mode column here. And that T stands for TDMA. Everything else that isn't phase 2 will typically have a D here for digital. And we'll talk a little bit more about this mode column in a couple of slides later. But what I will tell you is this. Ever since I started presenting this, the entire MARCS system has been a phase 1 system since it went in. I'm pretty confident it is going to stay a phase 1 system for a very long time, because in order for you to convert a talk group to phase 2, all of the radios that are owned by the agency using that talk group need to be phase 2 capable. And if they've invested $500,000 in radios that don't do phase 2, they're in no hurry to go to phase 2. Eventually, enough of these agencies are going to do tech refreshes on their equipment that every radio in the system will be capable of phase 2. And then it'll become advantageous to MARCS and these agencies to go to phase 2 because they'll be able to fit twice as many voice channels in the system without having to throw additional frequencies at the build out. Okay, I think I covered enough of the phase 1 versus phase 2. Here's what it looks like if you wanted to compare it side by side. So analog, which is comparable to today's amateur radio repeaters, 25 kilohertz wide voice channel. In phase 1, we cut that in half down to a 12.5 kilohertz channel. And you can see that you had one for the control channel, and then you had all your voice channels. Phase 2 still uses a wider control channel, but each of the voice channels are cut in half. So you fit 2 of them into that 12.5 kilohertz slice. Okay, talk a little bit about technology and the systems overview. When you're talking about programming a scanner or listening to them, there's a difference between a system and a site. A system is the overall trunk radio system. Cleveland's system is called the Greater Cleveland Regional Communications Network. MARCS is a statewide system with numerous sites, often based on county. Sites are a logical representation of one or more towers within that system, again, typically by county. And so in Summit County, like I told you, it's fully owned by the county. It's fully integrated into MARCS. So is Geauga, Lake. Lorain, except for like the State Patrol, is a substantial amount of conventional and some simplex P25, but there is discussion of some communities out there potentially making their own P25 system. In a statewide system like MARCS, there may be one or many sites in a given county, which makes it confusing. And a really good example of that is Portage County. And I have a little shot of it from the radio reference database down here. You can see they have the Shalersville, the Neomed, and the KSU site. Which one do you listen to? You really don't know. Now, what we will talk about is affiliation. If the agency or the talk group you want to listen to is affiliated to more than one of those, then it doesn't matter which one you're listening to. But that becomes a challenge if they don't affiliate to all of them and you're listening to the one that they keep falling out of. We'll talk about that when I explain multi-site MARCS in a little bit. So how do you listen to it? Basically, at the highest level, all you need to do is tell a scanner what the control channels are. If you tell it those control channels, it will learn every other frequency it needs to know from the control channel. It will either let you play every single talk group it ever hears, or it will play only the talk groups that you've defined in the predefined list. Based on what you're trying to accomplish is going to determine which of the two of those you do. But the vast majority of scanner listeners are using that second option where they listen to talk groups in a predefined list. When the scanner sees a match for a talk group that you've told it you're interested in, it will switch over to the frequency that communication is taking place on and play that audio for you until it stops, and then it'll come back to the control channel. So how do you find talk groups, right? We don't know they exist yet. Well, you can do what I said on the previous slide. On the whistlers, it's called wildcard scanning. On the Uninins, it's called ID search instead of ID scan. And then you start using context clues to listen to the communication taking place in that talk group to figure out what city is it, what agency is it, and then you submit those into the radio reference database, and they get listed in the database and pushed out to everybody that wants to see it. If you have no desire to do that, you don't ever have to. You can just rely on the radio reference database to get updated by other people. So if you are new to trunking, this is a correlation between what a frequency versus a talk group is. A long time ago, you knew that your favorite police department was always on a given frequency. You knew them by that frequency. In a conventional scanner, you would group interesting frequencies into banks that made sense to you to turn on or off. But in a trunk system, that department is now a talk group in a trunk system. In a trunk system, you add talk groups to your favorites, banks, or scan lists. And in that trunk system, those actual frequencies behind the scenes become mostly irrelevant to the listener. You just know that they're probably something in 700 or 800 megahertz. Here is an example. If we wanted to listen to Berea, and let's say you wanted to listen to the police and fire on the Cleveland system, more than likely you would go to the radio reference database. You would say, okay, I'm interested in 56351 and 56344. And you'd put them into your scanner. Now, what's new about this is firegrounds. A long time ago, if you wanted to listen to a fireground frequency, you had to be near the fire, right? Because they were on simplex. And if you were 6, 7, 8 miles away, chances are you weren't going to hear the fireground communication. Now, firegrounds are typically just another channel, or I'm sorry, another talk group, and that's coming out of every single tower in the county. You can be on the other side of the county and listen to the actual fireground firefight. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this slide, but basically, digital P25 systems are a big computer with a radio bolted onto it, right? So when a local system fails, it can go into something called fail-soft. And basically, it turns into a conventional repeater. A lot of people that didn't know their peers were communicating will suddenly find themselves on a frequency working together, and it just breaks that way. It breaks in a way that it provides some form of communication that may not be as good as it used to be. The other option is you can go into something called site trunking on a multi-site system like MARCS. And that gets a little bit more complicated. Some sites will go into site trunking mode. Sometimes it'll just stop working, and radios will start getting all kinds of error tones. There's a more in-depth description of all these fail states that the state of Indiana did. There's a link here in the slide deck, and if I haven't mentioned it, we'll probably make this slide deck available somewhere for people to go back and look at, as well as the recording. I don't want to go and dwell into too much of this because, frankly, on one hand, if it fails, you'll know because it doesn't work anymore, right? We aren't actual users of these systems for the most part. And on the other hand, I don't fully comprehend how these scenarios work in our particular systems, be it Cleveland and MARCS. So I don't want to speak too much to it and make it sound like I know exactly what I'm talking about here. This is a high-level review of the potential failures of P25. I will tell you this. Don't forget to put these interrupt channels in your scanner, and don't just assume that everything's happening on MARCS and Greater Cleveland systems. These are national interrupt channels. You'll hear them referred to tactically on the air as 8TAC92. And they're, like I said, they're national. They're not just on 800 megahertz, they're on 400, they're on 700, they're on 800. The 800 are the ones that I've heard used the most, and the entire list is on the radio reference database. Put these in your scanner as something to scan. They would obviously be a conventional scan. They wouldn't be part of a system scan. You never know when you might pick something up on these. I've heard local fire departments trying to use these to land helicopters and to try to use as a makeshift fire ground for some reason. I didn't understand why, but they did. Okay, I'm going to talk about the MARCS multi-site system. Hopefully I haven't lost many of you. But let's just start with what this radio is on the screen. If you've ever come out to Pedal to the Point, you've probably been handed one of these. This is one of the MARCS cache radios. They have a whole bunch of cache radios available in Pelican cases that can be deployed in emergencies, and in cases of 150-mile bike rides, they can potentially be loaned out for that type of use. This is a zone map of the MARCS system across the state of Ohio. And I'm just showing you this as a reference so you can get an idea when I do talk about zones in these slides. The upper third of Ohio is zone 2. And obviously the very lowest point is zone 3, right? And then you can see that basically there's 4 systems within MARCS that are defined as zones. Where that becomes relevant is when we start talking about affiliation and other limitations of the system. If you go into the radio reference database and you list every single site in MARCS by county, which is something I recommend you do when you're looking at it, because that'll help you determine that there's multiple sites in that county, you'll see things like Coshocton has, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sites. At least when I took this screenshot, it may have changed. And Cuyahoga County has just 1. But if you look at Cuyahoga County, here are all of those frequencies used by MARCS, right? We're not talking about the Greater Cleveland system here. So you need to look at this if you're trying to get an idea of A, how many voice channels a given county or site has, and how many control channels there are, especially if you're trying to configure something to use those control channels. So let's talk about affiliation. And I know this slide's busy. I'm going to try to dumb it down and not read directly from it. But basically, MARCS, when I first started writing this, was the largest public safety radio system in the United States, supposedly. It has around 5,500 talk groups, again, that we know about, that we've identified. There may be more. The sites and zones are interconnected by either telephone circuits or microwave RF links. And when you turn a radio on any P25 system, that radio is going to affiliate and request to join a talk group. If the talk group is set, it's set to is locally significant, it works within that site and those local voice frequencies. If the talk group is in use elsewhere in that zone or potentially statewide, the other sites using that talk group and the local site become linked via their data or microwave paths. So an example is if Lake County has one of those major winter car crashes on I-90, and one of the firefighters is at home in Euclid and turns on their handheld, all of the traffic from that Lake County talk group will now start coming out the MARCS towers using one of Cleveland's voice channels so that that firefighter who's at home in Euclid can hear it. And that will happen in addition to everything that was already taking place out in Lake County on their towers. that's a talk group level affiliation. So until that firefighter in Euclid turned his radio on, the Cleveland version of MARCS was not talking or transmitting any of the traffic from that fire scene talk group. The minute he turned his radio on, he caused Cleveland to join and link with Lake County. When radios are mobile and they transition from one area to another, they're automatically going to affiliate. And I have a really good example of that happening in southern Summit County here coming up. The reason I'm explaining this to you is if you're a scanner listener and you turn a talk group on and you wonder why you never hear anything, but you have reason to believe that communication is taking place there, this affiliation may be the reason. It may be happening in a different county and you're listening to a county that isn't affiliated. So let's use our Buckeye Breakaway bike tour as an example. We typically operate in 3 counties: Cuyahoga, Lorain, Ashland, right? We start in Brunswick High School, work our way into Lorain County, turn south, and we go to Ashland. That isn't happening this year, but we're going to use that example for this slide deck. So affiliation in that multi-site system like MARCS is going to impact, again, what you're going to hear. At the very bottom of this screen, I highlighted all the yellow cells, which are the control channels for those given counties. Let's see. We're going to use a talk group called XMarks10 in this example, and we've got a scanner user sitting in Brunswick who's decided to configure his scanner down here in the bottom left corner to listen to the Cuyahoga site. So he's only told it about the control channel 774.78125. He's only going to hear anything Cuyahoga talks about. However, if you look at the radios at the top, I have 3 SAG vehicles sitting in Ashland County, and they haven't started their trek back on Sunday. So they're all down in Ashland County affiliated to that site. There's no other radio user in the state of Ohio using XMarks10 but those 3 radios. The listener sitting in Brunswick listening to just Cuyahoga County will hear nothing, even if those 3 radios at the top of the screen are transmitting. And the reason is XMarks10 only exists at that moment in time in the Ashland County site. As the day progresses, one or more of those SAG vehicles is going to start traveling up towards Lorain County. And their radio is going to decide it would prefer to be affiliated to Lorain because it has a better receive and transmit, capability with Lorain, right? The scoring, so to speak, of that Lorain County site is better than Ashland. It can't hear or talk to Ashland as well as it can Lorain. When that happens, Lorain and Ashland are now going to communicate and say, hey, we both have radios on XMarks10. We need to create a link between us. And now anytime any of those 3 radios transmit, the Ashland site is going to use its local voice frequencies to play the audio there. And the Lorain County site is going to do the same using its voice frequencies. However, your scanner listener sitting in Brunswick still hears absolutely nothing. As the day goes on, at least one of our radios comes to the finish line at the Brunswick High School. And now all 3 of these sites are affiliated at that talk group layer. All 3 of them are playing the same audio. No matter which one of those 4 radios you see on the screen keys up, now the Brunswick scanner can hear it, even if it's just somebody in Ashland talking to somebody else in Ashland. And the reason is all 3 of those sites now are aware of XMarks10 being needed on their site, and they're utilizing their local voice channels to do it. And again, each site uses a different voice channel for the transmission because if you remember, and I think it's on this next slide, down here you can see all the different voice channels that a given site uses. Well, if it's on 772.98125 in Cleveland, that frequency doesn't necessarily exist in Ashland or Lorain, so it's going to use a completely different voice frequency when you're transmitting that. Now, this isn't limited to adjacent counties. It could theoretically be somebody all the way down in Hamilton County, down by Cincinnati, maybe somebody in Sandusky and somebody in Cuyahoga. The limitation is, will that particular talk group allow it? Some talk groups, if you go back to that map I showed you earlier, can only affiliate within the zone they're in, and some by design can affiliate statewide. And this particular slide is meant to show that you can take your scanner and you can point it to 2 different control channels, right? So if you point that scanner, and let's say you have a high enough antenna tower, on a tower that you can hear Ashland's control channels from Brunswick, which you very likely probably can. you could set your scanner up so that it's listening to Ashland and Cuyahoga. And if the radios are only in Ashland, you would still hear them, but it creates a problem with what's called dwell time. And I'm gonna explain dwell time in a slide or two. But let me give you one more real world example, and it was about affiliation with neighboring counties. I live in Summit County. When we went and turned our system into a MARCS site, I noticed a large number of Stark County fire engines and Wayne County police showing up on our system, which doesn't make any sense, right? Except for the fact that when those vehicles would get closer to the Summit County line, they would often find Summit County a more preferable system to affiliate to. And when they would do that, they would bring Summit County into affiliation with their given talk groups. The neat benefit of that is I can be up in northern Summit County, almost in Cuyahoga County, and I can hear things happening in Stark or Wayne County crystal clear on my scanner. As long as it doesn't create a negative effect for somebody in Summit County, there's no reason not to allow it. It's one of the benefits of creating this MARCS system, is that you fill in coverage gaps by affiliating with other neighboring sites. So I mentioned dwell time, and what dwell time is basically the time a scanner sits on a control channel data stream listening to active talk groups to see if there's something there that you want to listen to. The problem is the more systems or sites that you tell your scanner to scan, the longer it takes to get back to the beginning of your list. So if you put 2, 3, 4 systems in there, and then you're also telling it to listen to some conventional frequencies, it could take 6 to 10 seconds until it gets back and listens to something. And what that means is you're going to miss complete conversations on other systems or analog channels. And does anybody know how to fix this? You just buy more scanners. Now that's a joke that I've tried to reiterate through here, but the reality is it's true. If you want to hear things and not miss them, and you're going to use scanners to do it, you need to almost dedicate them, one to MARCS, one to Cleveland, and ideally, if you have any interest in anything conventional or analog, don't put it in your scanners that you use for digital systems, because they're either going to tie you up so you're not listening to the digital control channel, or you're going to be so busy listening to the control channel that you're going to miss complete transmissions on the analog side of the fence. Here's a guy that takes it to an extreme. Okay, so back to MARCS. MARCS does have something called TOWs or tows, whatever you want to call them. It's basically a tower on wheels. It can crank up to 80 feet tall. They make them available for emergencies or events, and they have 190 cache radios. Now that may have changed since I made this slide. They may have more, but we are a user of those cache radios for the Buckeye breakaway. But these, you may see these ever spun up in an event. And what you might want to know in case you ever need to listen to them is they're basically an isolated system inside MARCS that doesn't necessarily interact with the rest of the system. It has its own set of talk groups and it's unique. So you would need to program this into your scanner to use the specific frequencies in the radio reference database for that TOW device. And it has a unique system ID, and there's two or three of them. I think there's 3 of them now. All right, I'm going to go to regionalized dispatch. I know this might be what a lot of you came here to hear about. So let's see. So the whole main reason of regionalized dispatch is to save money, right? I mean, if we're saying it's not to save money, we'd probably be misleading ourselves. Why would governments invest in something if they didn't see it saving money? So just like, we use repeaters and they're idle for a large chunk of time, and that was the reason we went to trunking, the dispatchers sitting behind those microphones are, idle as well. And the idea of regional dispatch is you pull a number of cities into a dispatch center and use less human resources to dispatch for all of those different communities than you would if you had to staff multiple dispatch centers. Now, the opponents of this argue that a dispatcher who lives, let's say, in Summit County, and they come to work up in Cuyahoga County and they find themselves dispatching 911 calls for Rocky River that they never go to. When they get a call and somebody says, I'm behind the Arby's, that person doesn't technically know where that Arby's is because they don't even live in that community. So I personally feel like that's a valid argument, but it's not necessarily something that can't be overcome. So why would they do it? Well, one of the reasons is back in 2012, the state of Ohio passed a bill, House Bill 360, that reallocated how the 911 taxes that we collect on phone bills would be distributed to all the communities that run what's called a PSAP. And a PSAP, if you've never heard of it, is basically a public service answer point. It's where 911 calls are answered and dispatched. Now, if you look at the city of Cleveland, Cleveland will get its 911 calls directly into Cleveland Dispatch. Anywhere outside of Cleveland, if you call 911 from a wireless device, CCOMS is going to answer it. Now, thankfully, CCOMS now sits side by side with Chagrin Valley Dispatch in the same buildings. But prior to that, you could make a 911 call theoretically be answered by any PSAP if they wanted to. CCOMS has done it for an extremely long period of time. A county like Cuyahoga was expected to go from nearly 45 different PSAPs to a total of 4 or 5, where each of those communities that ran their own 911 dispatching center would lose tax dollars. That was the motivation that House Bill 360 passed. At the time, our governor, when he was the attorney general, made some changes to this in an opinion, and I forgot what those were, and I apologize. If anyone's curious, I can go dig it back up because I do want to put it back in the slide deck. But these were the 59 jurisdictions that existed in Cuyahoga County back in 2013. It basically served it was served by 45 different PSAPs, the most PSAPs in the entire state of Ohio, and one of the highest number of PSAPs in the entire country. These were all Cuyahoga counties. Now it has turned into this. Cleveland Police and Fire dispatches themselves. They do it out of the 3rd District. There's on the west side, the Southwest Emergency Dispatch Center in Strongsville. Chagrin Valley Dispatch started in Bedford. It now has a facility in Brecksville, and they're also part of the Heights Hillcrest Communication Center. Those 3 communities make up CVD. They also now have a 4th place that they can dispatch out of that I'll show you in a second. There's the West Shore Central Dispatch Center, and then obviously I mentioned CCOMS. The SECC in Bedford Heights, I believe, is completely defunct at this point. I probably should have taken it out of the slide deck. And then Parma and Parma Heights, they dispatch for themselves on their own system. And it says who dispatches who, but I put a slide in here that's new. And that is Chagrin Valley's new dispatch capability, which is this really, really cool vehicle. This picture was posted to their Facebook page. I had one of my own, but I like this one better because it was taken at night. They have been using this vehicle as a backup dispatch facility for the NFL draft. And what's inside this thing is pretty spectacular. I just didn't feel like it was appropriate for me to take any pictures. I can tell you that they are working to make this capable of communicating on ham radio. And Matt, I don't know if you're here and in a position to unmute and if you want to add anything or if I should just keep going.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
I'll just say that for those of you that are on Facebook, if you go to the Chagrin Valley Dispatch Facebook page and scroll down to about January when they first got this, they did post a bunch of pictures of the inside when they were doing some testing with it. So there's some more pictures. It's got 2, 4, I believe it had 6 dispatch positions for tactical dispatchers. There's another position outside that you can dispatch from. And I think there was I think he said either 9 or 11 different Motorola APX 8500 radios, which are all quad band, UHF, VHF, and all that. And now it has a zone of amateur radio frequencies in one of the radios because he allowed me to reprogram it when I was there yesterday or the day before. Yeah, yesterday, right? And then he's going to clone that into all the other radios so that he's able to talk on ham radio. And Jeff, you should be good now to unmute.
Okay, whoops. Sorry about that. I muted while you spoke.
Yeah.
Yep, okay. I didn't know they posted inside pictures. It's a really stunning vehicle, and really thrilled that they were interested to work alongside us in the ham radio community. I think that'll be a huge partnership going forward.
And I sent him an email also. Hopefully, if we're lucky, he'll bring this out to an Aries meeting. So we'll see what happens. Stay tuned.
Very good. Okay, so I didn't make a really fancy slide for the next two, but just if any of you are from Summit County, or if you ever find yourself potentially working in Summit County, these are the PSAPs currently in Summit County. As you can see, there's a number of them here. There is discussion of a regional dispatch being built somewhere, I believe, in the Stowe area, and a lot of these communities have signed on to that regional dispatch. So it is coming to Summit County. I can tell you that just due to my own knowledge of the politics in the northern half of Summit County, Twinsburg, as far as I know, has no intentions of not being their own dispatch center, as well as my city, Macedonia. We just purchased dispatch consoles and just went to the system literally a week ago. I can't imagine we would go to a regional dispatch system after investing in dispatch consoles. Portage County is similar. Their sheriff's office dispatches only themselves. Ravenna apparently dispatches a large portion of Portage County that isn't either dispatched by KSU or CENTCOM in Stark County. So let's talk about who in Cuyahoga County is dispatching who. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing, and I apologize if there is an error in this. This does change over time. I do my best to keep this thing as accurate and up to date as possible. But basically, everyone in the left column is being dispatched by Chagrin Valley's main location. The second column is what I call CVD South, but basically it's out of Brecksville. Heights Hillcrest has those 5 communities shown in the third column. Out west, I told you about the Southwest Dispatch Center. It does those 4 communities. And then there are some that I've shown here in red that I believe to this day are still in-house. It is possible that some of those have moved. I know Lyndhurst just got Grant Radio, so they are going to go to one of the 2 digital systems. And in the process, it's very possible that they would end up going to Chagrin Valley. I just don't know for sure yet.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes.
It's John, real quick. For the Westcom stuff, that's true for all. This is all accurate for fire, but all the PDs dispatch themselves on shared frequencies, just FYI. So like Bay, Fairview, River, Westlake, North Olmsted, all the PDs have their own dispatchers on shared channels, and Westcom is for fire.
If you don't mind, send that to me offline so I can update
Yep,
this.
I will.
Okay. So this is an attempt at showing you, even though they're dispatched by these agencies, which system are they on, which makes it really fun and complicated. If they're in the red color, they're on MARCS. If they're in the blue color, they're on Cleveland, which has got to just make it really interesting for Chagrin Valley, because some of them are on one system and some are on another. But if you've looked at the way the new dispatch consoles look, it's basically a computer. It's pretty slick. But you can see this is the politics of having 2 different systems in the county. Is some people are on one system, some are on another, and some are lingering on their conventional. And another added mix of this is sometimes you'll see a community has their fire on MARCS and their police on Cleveland, or vice versa, and don't necessarily always know the reason, but that's where we're at. So before I move on, because I'm going to get into a very high level discussion of programming, does anyone have any questions on regional dispatch? Oh, you can't unmute. I apologize.
Yeah, everybody should be able to unmute now.
Oh, they can? Okay. And I can take questions at the end. It's okay. We can push them to the end. Okay. So I'm going to talk about programming digital scanners. It's a very high level.
Real quick, you can always put them in the chat, and then we can address them all at the end, just
Sure.
so you don't forget them.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be great. All right, so I'm going to go through programming. I apologize that this is high level, but the reality is there's so many different scanners and so many different ways to program them that for me to try to sit here and get into the weeds on programming would literally be a 2-hour class all in itself. So basically, like I've told you before, if you want to program a scanner, 9 times out of 10, all you got to do is teach it what the control channels are. Then you have to go in and tell it the talk groups that interest you. That might just be 2 or 3 talk groups. I have scanners sitting here next to me that are listening to literally the police and fire of one city. That programming will then consist of identifying the systems or sites that you're interested in. Like I said, the talk groups, and then gathering them into relevant favorites or scan lists, depending upon the scanner or software, if you're doing software. And then you'll want to assign those things logical alpha tags And if you're using the radio reference database as your source, the good news is that alpha tags have already been assigned. So let's talk about radio reference. If you've never heard of it, it's basically a database of everything from frequencies to talk groups to on some of the wiki pages, they talk about which radio IDs belong to which departments. It's a repository that is comparable to the ARRL's repeater directory for scanner enthusiasts. It is crowdsourced. And when I say that, I mean, it's usually people like you and me, but oftentimes the people that are behind some of these systems are actually feeding the database information and they just don't take credit for it. What I've shown you here is a little bit of a sample on the right. It's a bunch of Cuyahoga County talk groups. They may have changed actually, because this slide, I haven't updated this slide deck in a while. So these agencies might be on a different talk group than what's depicted here. On the left, I've shown you what a conventional entry would look like if it's, you know, back in 420 or 155. On the right is what the digital talk group looks like. You can read this information for free. You don't have to pay for it. But if you want to have access to download it into some of the scanner applications, you do have to pay. Now you can screen scrape it sometimes, which basically just means highlighting it and copying and pasting it into some of the apps. And other times, if you don't want to pay for the access to the data, if you provide a stream to Broadcastify, you get free access to this database. But let's talk about the mode column. I did mention earlier I was going to talk about that. If you see a D in the mode column, it means it's digital. So typically that means P25. If there's an A in there, it's analog. If there's an E in there, it's encrypted. As I've told you earlier, just give up. If there's a T, it is phase 2, TDMA. And very rare, you'll see analog encrypted or mixed analog digital. I don't think I've ever seen that in anything Ohio in radio reference database, those last two. So when we are talking about programming, there's an application called FreeScan. And most modern software will interact with that database I just told you about. And what you see me doing here is logging in with my account and password. And then it shows me the systems that I have access to that I can program my radio with. On a subsequent page, after you've picked the different sites and locations, you can pick talk groups. And then it'll show you it'll show you the alpha tag that it's going to use to display there, as well as the decimal value of the talk group. And it'll default to obviously not locked out, not set to priority. All these values are defaulted. And you can go in there on a talk group by talk group basis and turn on colors or lock things out. And then you would upload this to the scanner. Newer scanners are not going to use FreeScan, so you can't do it to like any of the 436s or 536s. You do have to use something called Sentinel, and GRE has its own version of Whistler and Radio Shack, which I'll show you a screenshot of here in a second. This is PSR Edit. It is a $35 shareware alternative to the official software that you can get from Whistler. I have used this on a number of my scanners. And like my PSR 600, I've programmed with this. It will also use the radio reference database, which is almost a necessity again to program these things. This is the Whistler software. So if you have a Whistler model scanner, you'll get this application, which looks strikingly similar to the Radio Shack software because Radio Shack basically was inherited by Whistler. So this is Sentinel. Sentinel is the modern unit and programming application. This is what you would use to configure a 436, a 536, or any of the SDS models. And it is not necessarily the most intuitive application, but once you get used to it and you understand the quirks of Sentinel, you can get pretty dangerous at configuring your scanner. There is an application out there called ProScan. I have never purchased it. It only configures unit and scanners, and I don't recall off the top of my head if it can do the Home Patrol 436 and the SDSs. But with Sentinel out there, I don't know that you need to go out and buy ProScan for a modern scanner. There is something called Butel Arc. I've never used this, but if you read the discussion forums on Radio Reference, there are people that swear by this and will buy used licenses of ARC from other people so they can use it. I guess if maybe I was using this when it first came out, I might be beholden to it, but I just don't understand the interest. But it's in here just so you know that it exists. Okay, so I'm going to do some slides on software-defined radio. This may go over a lot of people's heads, but some of you may get something out of this. Don't be turned away by this. You can always just buy a scanner. So software-defined radio scanning. Basically, what is it? A long time ago, you could buy these inexpensive DVB TV tuners. They originated in the UK. They eventually came over to the United States. Some of them natively received from 500 kilohertz to 1.75 gigahertz. They were originally meant to be used for television on a computer, but they're based on a chipset called the RTL2823U. And software developers, basically open source developers, discovered that they could access all the raw data off of these via the USB port, and all of a sudden we have an inexpensive wideband software-defined radio that has become a substantial radio hobby in and of itself. Here's some of the options. You have the AirSpy that runs around $169. It can do a 10 megahertz wide receive. The SDR Play, it's $99. It had 2 megahertz wide slices. And then the Hack RF was a little bit unique in the sense that you could actually transmit with it. I don't have any of the ones that you see currently depicted, but I do have a lot of these. These are the inexpensive $20 ones. They run 20 to 30, depending upon if you buy them with an antenna or not. The antennas that these come with are, in my opinion, they're junk. They're such horribly manufactured antennas that the coax will pull right out of the base of the thing often. They do have a TCXO, which helps them stay on frequency, which was one of the original problems with these. But what you can do with these is typically a 2.4 megahertz wide receive, and I'll explain what that means in a couple of slides here. So what can you do with these? Well, I would recommend you take a screenshot of this slide because I'm not going to read it. Basically, you can do a million things with them. And if you want to learn what some of those are, there's a great website out there called rtl-sdr.com. Basically, you can do a lot of listening with the ones that don't transmit. And what I mean by that is you can listen to things such as like every single airplane above us right now that's flying around, beaconing its location, speed, altitude, etc., via ADS-B. And when you do, it looks like this. They actually make a flight-aware specific RTL SDR that is tuned to be 1080 megahertz. They make specific 1080 megahertz antennas. I have a fiberglass one upstairs. I'm picking up airplanes 300 plus miles away. It's just really cool. At the peak during the day, I'm plotting like 115 airplanes, and I don't even have that antenna mounted outside. It's sitting in a window with a western exposure. So you can do a million things with these in addition to listening to public service radio. So for instance, if you want to just buy one of them and plug it into a Windows machine, you can you can download some software called SDR Trunk, and you can set it up in such a way that even though you only have one of them, it will do retuning of the SDR. So if it knows that it needs to hop to a frequency to listen to something, it will retune it. And then when it's done listening to that transmission of the police or fire, it will retune itself back to the control channel. Now you're limited there. You can only listen to one thing at a time, but you've arguably simulated building a consumer grade scanner out of a $20 or $30 USB stick, which is not a bad thing to do. It might suffice what some of you want to do when it comes to scanning. There's another application out there called DSD Plus. Myself and a couple people that I know are on here. I heard their voices. We played with this when we first got into this. In my opinion, it is a substantial burden on CPU, and it requires something called virtual audio cables, or at least it did. I don't know if it still does, where you basically create virtual connectivity between different applications running in Windows. So you can take the received data from the RTL SDR, over to the application that knows how to decode that, and then it would turn it into WAV files and play it. This has gone through substantial evolutions and upgrades. There's a special version of DSD Plus called Fastlane, where I think you pay them a one-time flat rate, and you get new code releases like a week before everybody else or something like that. It's definitely something to play with if you're interested in doing it in Windows. However, we'll talk about something else other than Windows in a second. But every consumer grade scanner has a single receiver in it. And here's that reoccurring theme, right? 1 minute it's listening to that control channel, then it'll go down and that single voice or conventional channel is playing audio. And then when it's done, it goes back to the control channel. So in your conventional scanner, you can just listen to one thing. And we're always wondering, are you missing something? Is a channel that you would give more priority or more weight being missed? SDR dongles can solve that mistransmission dilemma by constantly listening to everything interesting. And then it can store it in a DVR-like fashion, right? And I'm going to show you how we do that. So you can go buy those same dongles I was showing you for $25 to $35. You can listen to 2.4 megahertz wide of spectrum all at once. So there could be 3, 4, 5 different channels in that 2.4 megahertz wide that you're listening to off one of these receivers. You can build what are called recorders, or in our terminology, VCOs, where you simultaneously pull off audio out of that 2.4 megahertz. Now it's very CPU demanding, okay? But the application I'm talking about is called Trunk Recorder. It is Linux based. It uses some existing software out there called New Radio and the OP25 project. It can monitor anything that's P25, SmartNet, phase 1 or 2, analog voice channels, and I don't think I put it in here, it can do simplex P25 systems, which are starting to pop up in Lorain County. It supports almost every piece of SDR hardware you can get out there. It can record virtually every transmission in a given system as long as you put enough of those dongles on it, and it'll write all that audio out as a MP3 file. And there's multiple ways you can hear that. You can take those MP3 files and put them into multiple front ends that you can listen to, and I'll show you a couple here in a second. So this is what it looks like. I have 4 of those hooked up to a server, and they have a center frequency. So you'll see this blue line always goes to a center frequency. And that's how you configure most SDRs, is you give them a center frequency, and if they're a 2.4 megahertz wide, they can see roughly 1 megahertz above and 1 megahertz below its center frequency. And anything inside that range, it can listen to. And if you can see here, I've put all the voice channels of the Summit County system in their 800 megahertz areas into different SDR receivers. And I can basically cover the 6.5 or 7 megahertz wide of Summit County with just 4 of these. And then I take every single transmission off of that system and write it into an MP3 file 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, how do you listen to that, right? How do you make that so it's not just a file on the disk? There's a website out there called openmegahertz.com. One of the developers behind the Trunk Recorder system wrote this, and you can actually upload your transmissions to openmegahertz.com, and it puts a web page interface in front of it. I don't use this. Myself and a couple of other people use something called Trunk Recorder, which has a different web interface to it, and you can build your own scan lists in here. So you can say, I want to listen to a whole bunch of fire frequencies, or I want to listen to, talk groups. I want to listen to a bunch of fire. I want to listen to these police frequencies, etc. But the beauty of this is, since it's kind of all cloud-based, and what I mean by that is we're pushing all the audio up to the internet, is I have a system out there that records everything and pushes it up to basically Amazon storage, where this web page that you see in the top right corner is deriving all of its information from, so it can play the audio and show you what's transmitted. But I'm not the only one doing it. There's some other people I know doing the same thing with the MARCS system, the Greater Cleveland system. We used to have, may still have, some Lorain County stuff in there. And so you now have, and actually now that I think about it, this is expanded into Geauga County and may actually expand into Lake. So now you have a 4 or 5 county wide system with retention, because you can play things that are, could be something that happened 30 minutes ago. It's a really cool system in the sense that you can retain it for days, you can access it virtually from anywhere, you can make scan lists that are fire, but they span multiple counties. And you don't miss transmissions for the most part, right? This equipment isn't infallible. It does miss some transmissions, but for the most part, you can hear everything because you're not stuck in that consumer scanner model of I only have one receiver and I can only listen to one thing. So that is the gist of everything in this presentation. If you guys have questions, I can answer them before you start asking them, though. I do see there was one asked in the chat. What makes the SDS 100 and 200 a simulcast buster versus other expensive radios? And give me one second. The scanner works so well is it's capable of listening to that QPSK signal. They have actually licensed the some technology that allows them to decode better than any other radio. And none of the other manufacturers, which at this point is Whistler, have gone out and done that. They haven't created a radio that's capable of that yet. And until they do, the SDS is going to have the market on that angle of being the best consumer grade scanner at listening to this stuff.